Northern Syria, roughly 11,000 years ago. No cities anywhere on the planet. No agriculture, no ceramics, no domesticated animals. According to every model of human development, the people living here should be chasing wild game across open steppe, sleeping under animal hides, and leaving nothing behind but flint scrapings and fire-cracked stone. Instead, they are cutting limestone blocks and stacking them into a circular tower with walls 1.5 meters thick. That tower is real. It was excavated by a Polish archaeological team beginning in 1999. It predates the walls of Jericho, the structure every textbook calls the oldest fortification on Earth, by more than 1,000 years. And it was not alone. 4 more towers stood beside it, built over centuries, embedded in a permanent settlement where people stored wild grain and carved chlorite tablets with images of serpents and geometric patterns that would not look out of place at Göbekli Tepe. This is not supposed to happen, not at this date, not with these people, but it did. And it happened again. On every continent, in every millennium, settlements appeared that the official timeline cannot comfortably accommodate. Cities with plumbing before Sumer had writing, fortifications that predate farming, hydraulic systems that dwarfed anything the ancient Near East ever attempted, brick standardization that showed up 1,000 years ahead of the civilization supposedly responsible for inventing it. 10 of them, all documented, all peer-reviewed, and all deeply inconvenient for the version of history most of us were taught. 11,000 years before the Common Era, the site is called Tel Caramel. It sits on a low mound above the Quake River, 25 kilometers north of Aleppo. If you stood here today, before the war made the region inaccessible, you would see dry grasslands scored by seasonal gullies, and nothing about the landscape would suggest what lies underneath. Ryszard Mazurowski, of the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology, began excavations here in 1999, expecting a modest Neolithic village, a few post holes, maybe some grain pits. What he found rewrote the chronology of monumental construction. 5 circular stone towers. The oldest, designated Tower 0, measured 6 meters in diameter. Its walls were built from dressed limestone blocks, carefully fitted and layered. Radiocarbon dates placed it at approximately 10,900 BCE. That is not a typo. That is a full millennium before the famous tower at Jericho, which until Caramel held the undisputed title of humanity's earliest known monumental structure. The residents of this settlement hunted wild asses and aurochs. They had not domesticated a single crop, and yet they were quarrying stone, shaping blocks, and raising towers that required coordinated labor from dozens, possibly hundreds, of individuals over extended periods. One of the towers contained a central post socket, suggesting a roof or internal support, a gathering space, a place where decisions were made, where authority spoke. The engraved chlorite plaques found in surrounding layers show snakes, birds, and abstract geometry that echo the carved pillars at Göbekli Tepe, 150 kilometers to the east and roughly 1,000 years younger. The conventional framework says permanent architecture follows agriculture. You settle down, you grow food, you accumulate surplus, then you build. Caramel inverts the sequence entirely. These people built first. The farming came later, or never, depending on how you read the botanical evidence. And that inversion is not a footnote. It is a challenge to one of the foundational assumptions of how civilization emerges. Mazurowski himself suggested the towers may have functioned as communal gathering halls, proto-temples, not fortresses. Others have argued for a defensive purpose, but nothing in the archaeological record settles the question. So what compelled hunter-gatherers to stop moving, quarry rock, and raise towers they would maintain for 1,000 years? Were these watchtowers, shrines, or something we don't yet have a category for? What hierarchy organized the labor, and why, after a millennium of continuous occupation, did the tradition end? 150 kilometers south and 1,000 years later, someone else was building in stone, but this time, the ambition was larger. You are standing at the edge of a ditch cut directly into bedrock, 8 meters wide, nearly 3 meters deep. The chisel marks are still visible in the stone. Behind the ditch, a wall rises 3.5 meters, thick, rough, unmortared, but unmistakably deliberate. And beyond the wall, a tower, 8.5 meters tall. Inside it, a staircase of 22 steps carved from single blocks of stone, spiraling upward through near-total darkness. This is Jericho, Tel es Sultan, the Jordan Valley. Roughly 9,500 BCE, Kathleen Kenyon's excavations in the 1950s established the basic stratigraphy, a pre-pottery Neolithic settlement surrounded by a massive ditch and wall, anchored by a tower that required an estimated 11,000 person-days of labor. That number implies something uncomfortable, either a centralized authority directing construction or a degree of communal coordination that no existing model of early Neolithic society can easily explain. But the tower's function remained unclear for decades, until a 2011 archaeoastronomical study changed the conversation. Researchers demonstrated that on the summer solstice, the shadow cast by the hills west of the settlement fell directly onto the tower at sunset. The alignment was precise enough to suggest intentional calibration, a calendrical marker, a ritual anchor, layered on top of whatever defensive purpose the fortifications may have served. And the people who lived behind that wall practiced something stranger still. They removed the skulls of their dead, coated them in gypsum to reconstruct the shape of a face, jaw, cheekbones, brow, and pressed cowrie shells into the empty eye sockets. These modeled skulls were kept in homes, placed on shelves or ledges where the living could see them, consulted perhaps, venerated, certainly. Imagine sitting in your house, eating your evening meal, and looking up at the reconstructed face of your grandfather, watching you from the wall. That was daily life in Jericho, 9,000 years before the Common Era. The mainstream position, advanced by Kenyon and refined by subsequent excavators, holds that the wall and ditch were primarily defensive, protection against raiders or rival groups competing for the permanent spring at the base of the tell. The counter-argument, which has gained traction since the 1990s, points to the local geology. Jericho sits at the mouth of a wadi, prone to flash floods and mudslides. In this reading, the ditch was drainage, the wall was a levee. That explanation accounts for the engineering. It does not account for the skulls. It does not account for the solstice alignment, and it does not explain why a settlement of perhaps 300 people invested 11,000 days of collective labor into a single tower when simpler solutions would have sufficed. Jericho has been inhabited almost continuously for 11,000 years. It may be the longest-lived city on Earth, and its oldest question remains unanswered. Who decided to build that wall, and on whose authority? Now here is something that nagged at me while reading the excavation reports from both sites. Tel Carmel and Jericho are separated by 1,000 years and several hundred kilometers. Different cultures, different climates, different subsistence strategies, but both communities chose to invest enormous labor into vertical stone construction, towers, at a time when almost no one else on the planet was doing anything remotely comparable. Both embedded their towers in residential areas. Both left no written record, no inscription, no explanation. Two independent experiments in monumentality, a millennium apart, with no known connection. That pattern alone deserves a longer conversation than it usually gets. 50 kilometers northeast of Jericho, on the outskirts of what is now Amman, Jordan, another settlement was growing. But this one did not stop at a few hundred residents. The year is approximately 7000 BCE. You are walking through a settlement that covers 15 hectares, 3 times the size of contemporary Jericho. The houses are rectangular, built from rough stone and mud brick, packed so tightly together that the alleys between them feel like corridors. The plaster walls are smooth under your hand. Somewhere beneath your feet, under the floors, skulls are buried, dozens of them, modeled with gypsum and painted with red ochre. Their pupils are made of bitumen, black, glossy, and fixed in a permanent stare. This is Ain Ghazal, and it may be the first place in human history where ambition outran the land's ability to sustain it. Gary Rolifson of Whitman College began publishing on Ain Ghazal in the early 1980s. His findings, reported in Science, documented something unprecedented: monumental anthropomorphic statues up to a meter tall, built on reed armatures and coated in lime plaster. Lime that had been produced at kiln temperatures approaching 900 degrees Celsius. Some statues had 2 heads. Nobody has convincingly explained why. Theories range from twin mythology to dualistic cosmology to artistic experimentation. None fully satisfies. More than 30 of these figures were found, deliberately buried in pits beneath communal buildings. Ritual objects given a ritual death. The act implies layers of belief. Objects sacred enough to create and sacred enough to destroy according to protocol. But the story of Ain Ghazal does not end with plaster and bitumen. It ends with goats. Isotopic analysis of surrounding soils shows progressive degradation of the plant layer across the settlement's lifespan. The residents kept large herds of domesticated goats. The goats ate everything green. The topsoil eroded. The springs weakened. By approximately 5000 BCE, the site was abandoned, not conquered, not burned, but quietly starved of the ecosystem that had sustained it. And here is what I keep returning to. 4 of the 10 settlements in this investigation were destroyed not by invaders, not by earthquakes, not by plague, but by the consequences of their own success. Ain Ghazal overgrazed itself into dust. I have spent more time with Neolithic goat population data than is probably reasonable, and the conclusion is hard to dodge. The first ecological collapse we can document was self-inflicted. Maybe the greatest enemy of civilization was never the barbarian at the gate. Maybe it was always the herd in the backyard. Were the two-headed statues objects of worship, political symbols, or something we lack a category for? Was Ain Ghazal ruled by a council or by an invisible elite whose houses looked the same as everyone else's? If they watched the soil dying year after year, did they try to stop it? Did they argue about it the way we argue about climate? And if they did, who won that argument? From the hills of Jordan, we follow the Tigris southeast, into the flat alluvial plains where Mesopotamia's earliest civilizations would eventually rise. But not yet. 4,000 years before the first cuneiform tablet was pressed into wet clay, someone here was already digging irrigation channels and keeping records. Start with what we know. You are inside a mud brick house. The floor beneath your feet is smooth plaster. Somewhere below it, and you can see the edges of the pit if you look carefully, there are bones. Small bones. Hundreds of infant skeletons, found beneath the floors of private homes across this settlement. Each placed inside a carved alabaster vessel, smooth and pale as milk. Each surrounded by offerings, figurines of women with wide, dark eyes lined in bitumen, necklaces of obsidian traded from volcanic sources hundreds of kilometers to the north. The adults who lived in these houses walked over these burials every day. They cooked above them. They slept above them. This is Tel Es-Sawan, the middle course of the Tigris, south of modern Samarra. Roughly 6000 BCE, Behnam Abu al-Suf's excavations in the 1960s revealed a settlement ringed by a ditch 3 meters deep and a mud brick wall, the oldest fortification yet documented anywhere in Mesopotamia. The houses inside followed a strict T-shaped floor plan, with up to 14 rooms each, far more than a simple family would need. The bricks were standardized, pressed into molds, not shaped by hand, a technological step most scholars associate with periods 2,000 years later. And then, buried among the domestic debris, 77 small clay tokens, cones, spheres, discs, cylinders. They look like children's toys, until you compare them with the accounting tokens excavated at Uruk and Susa 3 millennia later. The shapes match, the sizes correspond, the principle is identical. These are counters, units of measure, accounting in embryo. Mainstream Assyriology places the origin of systematic record-keeping in the Uruk period, around 3500 BCE. Sawan's tokens predate that by 25 centuries. The implication is uncomfortable for anyone invested in the Sumerian origin story. What if Sumer did not invent accounting? What if it inherited a system that was already ancient? I have sat with that question for longer than I should admit, and every time I revisit the evidence, the same conclusion returns. Sumer's genius may have been not invention, but codification, taking something old and giving it a new form. Catherine Brenéquet of the Université de Limoges spent years synthesizing the burial evidence and published a comprehensive analysis in 2016. The infant burials remain the site's deepest puzzle. Were these sacrifices? A ritual of symbolic rebirth, returning a dead child to a womb of stone? Or were they expressions of grief so total that nothing less than permanent architecture could contain them? The alabaster vessels are exquisitely carved. Someone shaped each one with care and time. Bitumen seals, pressed with stamps, were found on storage containers, an early form of property marking. Who owned what at Tel Es-Sawan? Who counted the tokens? And who decided which children deserved a vessel of carved stone? Leave the river plains behind, Where we are going, the air smells of thyme and pine resin, and the ground plan makes no sense at all. You are looking at an aerial photograph of a hilltop settlement in Thessaly, Greece. 6 concentric stone walls, nested one inside the other like rings on a target. At the exact center, a single rectangular building with a columned porch facing an open courtyard. The whole thing looks planned, intentional, almost diagrammatic. This is Dimini, roughly 4,800 BCE. If you walk the site today, the concentric pattern is still legible in the foundations. The walls were built from limestone slabs and river cobble, packed with clay. They had no towers, no arrow slits, no crenellations, no sign, in other words, of conventional military architecture. G. Or Muziadis, who published the definitive study of Dimini's spatial organization in 1979, argued that the walls served not as fortifications, but as social boundaries, physical dividers separating clans, workshops, storage areas, and social ranks within a single community. If that reading is correct, then what you are looking at is not a castle. It is an organizational chart, built in stone. The building at the center, the megaron, was larger and more elaborately constructed than anything surrounding it. Its floor plan is a rectangle with a front porch, a central hearth, and a rear chamber. That layout would echo through the next 3,000 years of Greek architecture. Mycenaean palaces, archaic temples, the inner cell of the Parthenon itself. All of them trace their ancestry back to this single room on a Thessalian hilltop, occupied by a person, or a family, whose authority was literally at the center of everything. Dimini's residents traded distinctive polychrome pottery, found as far as the Aegean Islands. They used spondylus shells, marine bivalves from the Aegean, carved into rings and discs, as a form of currency. Spondylus does not occur naturally in Thessaly. Every piece had to be imported. The fact that these shells functioned as money tells you something about the reach and sophistication of the exchange networks involved. And their society was visibly stratified. The megaron's occupant commanded a fundamentally different material life than the people in the outer rings. This represents a sharp departure from what had existed in the same region for 2 millennia. Because less than 15 kilometers away, on a slightly lower hill, stood a settlement built on entirely opposite principles. Sesklo, older by 2,000 years, and egalitarian in a way Dimini conspicuously was not. Dimitrios Theocharis excavated Sesklo through the 1960s and 1970s, and what he documented was the oldest multi-level residential architecture in Europe. You would recognize the construction if you saw it. Houses with stone foundations, mud brick walls on timber frames, a second story accessible by ladder or internal stairs, packed together so tightly that the passages between buildings measured barely a meter or two, a labyrinth of shoulders-width alleys, dark even at midday. Kiln temperatures for pottery production reached 800 degrees Celsius. The resulting ceramics were thin-walled, technically refined, painted in red on white in repeating geometric motifs that remained consistent for centuries. A visual identity as deliberate as any modern brand. No megaron at the center. No building noticeably larger or richer than its neighbors. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains shows that 90% of the diet came from domesticated sheep and goats, and that diet was shared uniformly across the settlement, with no evidence of differential access to protein. Clay models of houses, found in the debris layers, suggest the residents built miniature maquettes before undertaking full-scale construction. Architectural planning, scale models, 5,000 years before anyone wrote the word blueprint. Around 4,400 BCE, Sesklo burned. The fire layer is stark in the stratigraphy, a thick band of carbon and ash sealing the older levels. After the destruction, the culture that rose in its place was Dimini's. 2 settlements, 15 kilometers apart. One built on shared labor without visible hierarchy. The other organized around concentric rings of status, with a single authority at the core. One lasted 3 millennia. The other replaced it within a generation. Was it invasion? Internal revolution? A slow cultural shift that the archaeological record compresses into what looks like a single violent event. Kostas Kotsakis at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki has spent decades on this question, and the honest answer is that nobody knows. What we can say is this: Thessaly hosted 2 simultaneous experiments in organizing human life. one egalitarian, one hierarchical. The egalitarian model lasted longer. The hierarchical one won. Why? What advantage did centralization offer that 3 millennia of collective decision-making could not match? And here is the question that bothers me most. Did the people of Sesklo see it coming? Did they resist, or did they welcome the change? Now, something about this next case caught my attention in a way the others did not, and I have learned, over the course of many investigations, to pay close attention when my instincts start pulling at a detail. Call it a good nose. I have always had a good nose. Northeast Bulgaria, a low mound called Prevadia Solnitsata. The name translates roughly as the salt pit. That is exactly what it was, and what it became was far more significant than the name suggests. Vasil Nikolov of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences has spent 20 continuous seasons excavating this site, and his findings describe the oldest industrial salt production center in Europe, operational by 5500 BCE. Brine was drawn from underground springs, poured into large ceramic vats, and evaporated inside domed kilns capable of producing up to 10 tons of salt per year. That figure is for the early phases. By the late Neolithic, around 4500 BCE, the operation had scaled to something resembling a factory. Salt was no longer produced in rough lumps. It was molded into standardized cakes, uniform in size, uniform in weight, and distributed across the Balkans through a network of documented trade routes. Archaeologists have found evidence suggesting that the saltworks employed laborers from outside the community, workers recruited from neighboring regions and paid in the product itself. Salt as wage. The original white gold. Standardized cakes. Consider what that requires. Agreed upon units. Quality enforcement. A system of exchange in which both buyer and seller trust the measure. Some researchers have called Prevadia Europe's first mint. Not for coins, for commodity currency, a medium of exchange made of crystallized seawater. The settlement was protected by stone walls up to 2 meters high, rebuilt at least 3 times after earthquakes, a triple fortification system in a region where nothing else remotely comparable existed. Inside, archaeologists recovered a ritual pit containing a ceramic vessel shaped like a bull, a fertility symbol common across Neolithic Balkans, and, nearby, a ceramic mask with no mouth. Tabloid coverage labeled it the face of an alien. Nikolov's interpretation was more measured, a representation of a local deity associated with salt, silence, or the earth. The wealth Prevadia generated was not abstract. The Varna necropolis, 50 kilometers to the east, contains the oldest processed gold objects in the world, graves where men were buried with gold scepters, gold bracelets, and gold-plated axes. The trade connection between Varna's gold and Prevadia's salt is among the most thoroughly documented exchange relationships in European prehistory. Salt preserved meat, gold preserved status. Both traveled the same roads. Was Prevadia an independent city-state, governing itself and its monopoly behind those rebuilt walls? Or was it one hub in a wider web of Karanovo, Gumulnitsa, Kojoderman cultures, sharing resources and ideology across the Balkans? The evidence supports both readings. Who controlled the kilns? Who set the weight of a standard salt cake? And the mouthless mask, displayed behind glass in a museum in Sofia, is it a god, a warning, or a portrait of someone who was never meant to speak? From the salt fields of Bulgaria, we cross the Mediterranean to a hilltop in southern Spain, where someone built a fortress complex that should not exist for another 2,000 years. Almeria, the dry southeast corner of Iberia, a triangular plateau overlooking the confluence of the Andarax and the Rambla de Huichar. The soil is pale, the light is harsh. You are standing inside 4 concentric defensive walls, the outermost stretching 310 meters, reinforced by 19 stone bastions. Beyond the walls, on the surrounding hilltops, 13 satellite forts maintain line-of-sight contact with the central settlement. This is Los Miares, roughly 3,200 BCE, the apex of Copper Age complexity in Western Europe. Antonio Arribas and Fernando Molina spent decades documenting the site, and a 2007 analysis published in the Journal of Archaeological Science added a detail nobody expected. Fort No. 1's bastions are arranged at the vertices of a regular hexagon. Not an approximation, not a rough echo of symmetry. A deliberate, precise, geometric construction. Applied mathematics executed by builders who left behind no mathematical notation of any kind. Inside the citadel, water was channeled through a stone aqueduct from an external cistern located beyond the residential zone, an early infrastructure for centralized supply. In the necropolis below, more than 80 megalithic tholos tombs held up to 100 individuals each, stratified by social rank. The offerings tell the story of a community with long arms. Arsenical copper axes exported across Iberia, ostrich eggshells from North Africa, ivory objects proving sustained maritime trade across the Mediterranean. This was not a village with a wall, this was a system. Fortifications, satellite surveillance, water infrastructure, copper metallurgy, hierarchical burial, and international trade, all functioning simultaneously, at a date when most of Western Europe lived in dispersed homesteads. The central debate is about what to call it. Was Los Millares a state, a centralized political entity with rulers, administrators, and taxation? Or was it a seasonal convergence point, a place where scattered clans assembled for trade, ritual, and collective defense before dispersing back to their own valleys? The hexagonal geometry argues for permanent, specialized knowledge, someone who understood angles and could teach them. The seasonal model argues for fluidity and negotiation. The dead, ranked in their stone tombs with African ivory in their hands, argue for both and settle nothing. Who designed the hexagonal fort, and where did they learn geometry without a written numeral system? How did ostrich eggs travel from the Sahara to a hilltop in Almeria? And if Los Millares was truly a state, where are its successors? Because when the settlement was abandoned around 2250 BCE, nothing comparable replaced it for centuries. From the geometric bastions of Iberia, we travel east, far east, past the Mediterranean, past Mesopotamia, past the Indus, all the way to the dry plains of Haryana in northern India, where one radiocarbon date upended a century of assumptions. The year is 7500 BCE. At least, that is what the lab results say. And that number is the entire problem. The Indus Valley civilization, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, the great planned cities with their grid-patterned streets and indoor plumbing, is supposed to begin around 3300 BCE. The mature phase, with standardized weights and perfectly proportioned bricks, dates to roughly 2600 BCE. That is the framework taught in every South Asian archaeology course on the planet. Birana says the framework is incomplete. L.S. Rao of the Archaeological Survey of India excavated Birana beginning in 2003. Anindya Sarkar's team at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research confirmed the radiocarbon chronology in a 2016 study published in Nature Scientific Reports. Charcoal samples from the deepest occupation layers return dates of approximately 7500 BCE. That makes Birana one of the oldest continuously inhabited agricultural settlements in all of Eurasia. The earliest phase, period 1A, consists of pit dwellings with floors plastered in bright yellow alluvium, carried from the banks of a nearby river. A river the excavators identify with the Sarasvati, the great waterway described in the Rig Veda, now vanished beneath the sands of the Thar Desert. That identification is fiercely contested, and rightly so. It carries political and religious weight that extends far beyond stratigraphy. But here is what is harder to argue with. By period 2, the settlement contains brick construction with a standardized ratio of 1 to 2 to 3, length to width to height. That ratio is the defining signature of mature Harappan architecture. Except at Birana, it appears a full 1,000 years before the so-called mature phase. Standards do not generate themselves. Someone established them. Someone enforced compliance across workshops, and that someone was operating in a community that also possessed a water filtration system of striking sophistication, alternating layers of sand, gravel, and charcoal, used to purify monsoon runoff before storage in clay-lined reservoirs. And then there is a detail that stopped me cold. On a ceramic fragment from Birana, excavators found scratched graffiti depicting a figure in a dancing pose, arms extended, hips cocked, weight on one leg. The posture is virtually identical to the famous bronze dancing girl statuette from Mohenjo-Daro, dated roughly 4,000 years later. The same gesture, the same attitude, separated by 40 centuries. Cultural DNA does not survive that long by accident. Someone was teaching it. Someone was remembering. One more detail, and this is the one that made me dig deeper into the excavation reports than I probably should have, because once I catch a loose thread, I cannot leave it alone. Across 5,000 years of continuous occupation at Birana, very few weapons have been recovered. The record suggests sustained, largely peaceful development. That alone distinguishes it from nearly every other site in this investigation. Who established the brick standard? And how was it transmitted across generations without any form of writing? What was the true relationship between Birana and the later Harappan cities? Direct ancestor? Parallel development? Or something more complicated? And if the Sarasvati connection holds, how many more settlements lie buried under the shifting sands of Rajasthan, waiting? And now, the last stop, the farthest point on the map. The case that, if you have been following the pattern of this investigation, you already suspect will be the strangest. You are standing on an artificial platform, 30 hectares wide, 15 meters above the surrounding wetland. The air is warm and heavy with moisture. Every direction you look, water. Canals cut in straight lines between raised fields, reservoirs holding thousands of cubic meters. And beyond the city, stretching across the valley mouths, a system of 11 earthen dams built from alternating layers of clay wrapped in woven reed bundles, a technique called hunshao, engineered to flex during earthquakes rather than crack. This is Liangzhu, the Yangtze Delta, southeastern China, 3,300 to 2,300 BCE. Liu Bin and his colleagues at the Zhejiang Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology spent 2 decades mapping the hydraulic network. A 2017 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences confirmed what the engineering scale implied. This was the earliest large-scale water management system in China, and among the earliest anywhere on Earth. Construction of a single major dam required an estimated 3,000 workers laboring for 8 years. The city was designed for water. 8 of its gates accommodated boat traffic. Only 1 was built for people on foot. This was a civilization that moved by floating, and it was not primitive in any dimension. Residue analysis has confirmed that the residents practiced silk weaving and applied lacquer to wooden objects, technologies usually attributed to much later Chinese dynasties. On the central platform, the citadel called Mojiaoshan, the elite lived and died. We know they were elite because their tombs contain thousands of jade objects, bai discs representing heaven, Kong cylinders representing earth, ceremonial blades, and pendant ornaments, all carved with a precision that approaches the absurd. 5 incised lines per millimeter. Think about that. You cannot see 5 lines per millimeter with the naked eye without strain. These were accomplished without metal tools, using bamboo drills, sharkskin abrasives, and quartz sand, in a process that must have taken individual artisans months or years per object. Modern jade carvers, equipped with diamond-tipped rotary instruments, find this level of fineness difficult to replicate. The question that divides researchers is governance. Was Liangzhu's vast hydraulic system the product of coerced labor, a despotic regime forcing thousands to dig and haul? This is the hydraulic hypothesis, proposed by Carl Wittfogel in the 1950s, which argues that large-scale irrigation inevitably produces centralized, authoritarian control. Or was the labor voluntary, communities pooling effort because the alternative was losing everything to the next flood? The jade may hold a clue. The Kong cylinders are decorated with a motif scholars call the spirit face, a humanoid figure with oversized circular eyes and a feathered headdress, repeated identically across hundreds of objects from dozens of separate sites spread across the delta. Identical motifs imply shared belief. Shared belief implies communication, coordination, some form of consensus. Despots do not usually seek consensus, they impose it. Liangzhu did not fall to an army, it fell to water. A thick layer of flood silt blankets the entire site, the unmistakable signature of a catastrophic inundation, most likely triggered by extreme monsoon activity around 2300 BCE. The dams that had held for generations failed. The fields drowned. The jade carvers and canal builders and the priests atop the platform walked away from the most ambitious engineering project of their age and never returned. And here is the thought I cannot let go of. Ain Ghazal was destroyed by its own goats. Liangzhu was destroyed by the very water it had spent centuries learning to master. Separated by 6,000 kilometers and 4,000 years, two civilizations repeated the same lesson in different elements. The force that makes you powerful is the same force that can erase you. Did they know? Could they have known? Can we? 10 settlements, 3 continents, 11,000 years of evidence. Towers raised by people who had not yet learned to plant a seed. Skulls coated in gypsum and fitted with shell eyes. Salt hardened into currency before anyone had minted a coin. Bricks standardized the millennium ahead of the cities that supposedly invented the standard. Dams built by artisans who carved 5 parallel lines into a single millimeter of jade. Without metal, without writing, without any of the tools we insist are prerequisites for complexity. The timeline we were taught is not fabricated, but it is missing chapters, and the settlements that wrote those chapters are still in the ground, half read, waiting for someone with enough patience and enough nerve to finish the translation. Which of these 10 cases do you find most convincing? Tell me in the comments and defend your answer. If you want to be here when the next investigation drops, subscribe. This is nowhere near finished.